Sheila, you ready?
I am, but the host it says that I can't start my video. The host has control over it. Okay. There we go.
Perfect. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the latest program in NJPP's Progress 2020 virtual speaker series, The Recovery Starts Local. My name is Louis Paolo, and I'm the Communications Director at NJPP. I am also a former councilman in my hometown, the borough of Dumont, New Jersey. So I'm very excited for today's talk, where we're going to take a deep dive into the role of local governments in New Jersey's COVID-19 recovery. As many of you know, state and local governments had their budgets decimated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the efforts to spread the curve of the virus. In this talk, we're going to break down the damage done by COVID-19 to local governments and what state and local lawmakers can do to respond to the crisis in a way that avoids cuts to public services that our families and communities rely on. So today, we're joined by two very esteemed panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Sheila Reinertsen, who is a senior policy analyst at New Jersey Policy Perspective. Sheila is one of the leading experts in the state on issues pertaining to tax policy, the state budget, budgeting best practices, and state corporate tax subsidies. We are also joined by Marc Pfeiffer, who is a preeminent expert on local finance. He is currently a senior fellow and assistant director at the Blaustein Local Government Research Center, and he has decades of experience both in local government administration and in the state's local government oversight agency, the Division of Local Government Services. We are so fortunate to have Marc not only here on this call, but also here in New Jersey, because he's such an incredible resource to both state and local lawmakers alike. So before we get started, I just want to first thank you all for tuning in on a Thursday afternoon. And I'd also like to give a special thank you to the sponsors who made today's event possible, especially Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield, the B. Gill Group, and RWJ Barnabas for their generous support for the Progress 2020 webinar series. So we'll be opening up the discussion later on to an audience Q&A. So please use the comments in the Facebook feed. If you have any questions, you can drop those in at any point in this video discussion. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Marc, my first question is to you. What role do municipal and county governments play in the response to the coronavirus, and what impact has the pandemic had on municipal and county finances?
Thanks, Lou. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here to work with Policy Perspective, a group I've worked with for a very long time, like since its beginning. On your point of the question, municipalities and counties are really in positions of being first responders, and it also really depends on the municipality and the county and their local population. If you had to summarize it all, their role is essential service coordination, making sure police services, fire services, EMS services, regardless of how they're provided, whether it's by contract or by volunteers or paid employees, that all those services were working together to deal with this very new problem we had of how we try to isolate people, quarantine people, get people to shelter in place, and then socially distance activities where businesses were going to be open and how people were going to respond to that. They in some cases coordinate with food banks, social service organizations, and making sure a lot of the basic work of day-to-day government goes on, that essential construction is able to continue when it has to, deal with construction plan and inspection review, and the routine things. If firefighters and police officers are out working, they have to be paid. They can also start taking advantage of some of the changes that we saw with less traffic. So maybe they could do some more maintenance that had been deferred and get it done faster and easier. Fields still have to be maintained as well. And again, I think social services in a number of communities where you had people who were out of work, needing food bank support, local governments play a significant role in that. And counties have a similar role, but it's done on a regional basis. I think one other important point that's really becoming obvious right now is that as we start to restore the economy, municipalities that have local businesses in downtowns, they are working very hard to figure out how they fit into the reopening plans, supporting those businesses to bring people back into their communities for shopping purposes. That's the good part of what they have to do. The challenges that this presents, however, is revenue shortfalls. Although property taxes are a very reliable source of revenue, more municipalities today are relying on hotel and motel taxes, and we've seen a lot of that business shut down. We've seen other fees and revenues. Municipal courts have shut down, and to the extent that those revenues are important, those become a loss. We've got some number of people who are having trouble paying their property taxes because they're out of work. These are things that municipalities are facing, on top of emergency expenditures. They've got to buy things now. They've got to reorganize and replan their office space, make sure their employees have personal protective gear. These are all things that are done at the county and municipal level and creating stress. And if there's one last point to make on that, is they're trying to manage uncertainty. And that is one of the biggest challenges that we all face right now, is what is the future going to bring and how do you plan for it? So that, I think, is kind of covers the gamut of those things that we're dealing with now.
Perfect. Thank you, Marc, for that thoughtful answer. And apologies to everyone watching on Facebook. We see in the comments that there's some issues with the connection. We will try to troubleshoot that on our end, but if you can all just be patient while we try to get that figured out. Moving on, the next question I have is to Sheila. The COVID-19 pandemic, and especially the efforts to curb the spread of the pandemic, have really decimated state and local budgets across the country. To help start us off and ground this conversation, can you catch us up on what the federal government has done so far in order to aid state and local governments? And then as a follow-up question, has that been enough or is more action needed?
Thanks, Louie, and thanks for everybody for hanging in there. We'll try to get that fixed as soon as possible. So briefly, New Jersey has received billions in federal aid to cover the response and recovery expenses related to COVID-19. And that includes $750 million in FEMA relief aid specifically for counties and municipalities. The state has received $2.4 billion in aid through the CARES Act, the federal aid that came through. And some of that, a slice of that, will go actually to local governments to cover expenses that FEMA will not cover. New Jersey Transit has received a $1.4 billion grant, and a variety of federal departments like HUD and Justice Department and Health and Human Services have allocated specific aid to boost existing programs like Medicaid and SNAP benefits. But yes, the answer is it enough? No, it's not enough. New Jersey's finances are in a real crisis, and the state needs more flexibility from the federal government. It would be great if it was in the form of aid and soon, but it is looking more and more unlikely based on the disinterest from the US Senate. Projected revenue loss for fiscal year 20, which we're currently in, and the next fiscal year 21 is enormous and puts New Jersey's progress toward reducing its ongoing fiscal imbalance between revenue and its outsized obligations in jeopardy. Right now is a huge moment of uncertainty. A lot depends on the trajectory of the virus, how quickly the economy can recover. These two major factors alone will determine the size of structural deficit in the finalized 21 budget. But it is pretty clear right now, without additional substantial federal help, New Jersey likely will be forced to gut critical programs such as education and healthcare. They'll have to lay off teachers and other workers in even greater numbers and cancel contracts with many businesses. And those kind of steps actually worsen the recession. They delay the recovery, and they further harm New Jersey families and communities, especially communities that are very vulnerable to the effects of a recession. state and local cuts will also affect healthcare. The ability to give healthcare during a coronavirus response efforts.
Perfect.
Well, if I can jump in, I think it's one of the challenges is that we've got different sectors with different sets of problems. For example, Sheila just mentioned the healthcare sector. Completely separate from the issues facing state and local government is healthcare and how they're going to respond. And part of the CARES Act does provide aid to our hospital systems, but there's still a lot of uncertainty on how much money is going to come down and how it goes out. For state and local government, we've got FEMA money, which is intended to cover at least 75% of the emergency response costs that state and local government and including counties and schools there that they have in responding. But under current law, that requires a 25% match, and it's uncertain. And people have asked, but we don't know if the federal government's going to allow the CARES money to be applied toward that 25% match, or if perhaps the 25% match will go away on its own. That's an administration issue right now, and possibly a future issue for Congress to deal with.
Thanks for jumping in, Marc, and providing that additional context. I think we're going to touch on some of those issues, especially the cap, a little later on in the discussion. But my next question for you, Marc, is with few exceptions, because of a lot of different state laws and regulations, New Jersey's municipalities and counties, historically, they've been very good at keeping their fiscal affairs in good standing. They're, like I mentioned, guided by different state statutes that also allow for emergency appropriations and also short-term bonding to finance them. What is it about this pandemic that has local governments so worried, even when they have these capabilities to both have emergency appropriations and borrow?
Because our system of anticipating revenue in the state is very rigorous and is intended to ensure that revenues in municipality or county and anticipate in their budget, they're really going to be there. And that system has worked well since about 1918. The challenge has been is that the legal side of it never quite had to deal with the problem of significant revenue shortfalls that were unanticipated during a fiscal year. We've got a hole there. It's not an impossible hole to fix, and there's some workarounds to it. But municipalities that have cash deficits right now have a requirement that they have to replace that lost revenue in the following fiscal year, which means they would have to raise taxes to bring that revenue in. Similarly, when it comes to emergencies, we have a body of laws that deal with weather-related emergencies and some other variations on that theme, but we don't have a specific laws that deal with a public health emergency and permitting to spread those emergency costs out over several years. So we've got a kind of a statutory legal thing. There's some workarounds, but we really need to clarify for municipalities and counties that yes, they can be able to finance those deficits, be it a revenue deficit or an emergency expenditure, that they can finance those over some period of time. And as we'll get to, I think there's been some debate about how that's going to work.
Great, thank you. And then as a follow-up to that, let's talk more about this uncertainty that the municipalities are facing, and specifically what state lawmakers are proposing right now to help support New Jersey's local governments. There are some competing bills that are advancing through the legislature right now. Can you tell us a little bit about them, first broadly, but then also the pros and cons of each and how they differ?
Well, I think if we look at it sort of chronologically, when we first started to see the impacts of this a couple months ago, there was a flurry of legislation that went to what we call our go-to solution, is that when we have emergencies that we haven't quite faced before, we create an exception of what we call a special emergency. And we say, okay, you can finance those emergencies up to 5 years. And that's our go-to solution. We do it regularly. It happens when the unanticipated happens. So we've got a couple bills out there that would do that. Another quick response bill, particularly in response to the uncertainty of revenue losses and when revenue losses are going to come back, was another bill that was advocated by some mayors and some municipal and county government organizations that say, okay, if you have these revenue losses and emergency expenditures, you can take those and finance them up to 10 years without approval of what we call the State and Local Finance Board, which is responsible for overseeing these types of things. That without approval of the board, you could go ahead and finance these numbers, which are sort of, were not really specified in the bill, that they could go ahead and finance those for up to 10 years. There's some couple issues with those, and I think that will work out. In a later bill, and I have to fully disclose here, I had sent a memo to a number of state officials suggesting that here's an approach that would deal with these problems that are consistent with the way we traditionally do things, which is create an ability to pay off that revenue deficit over a number of years, take those emergencies, pay for them over a number of years, and engage the local finance board when that default number of years is going to go longer. So that bill suggests that there may be a 7-year payoff for these uncertain deficits, which may be reasonable. And if you want to go longer than that, you would have to get local finance board approval. And that bill also specifies, here's the formula of how you come up with the actual revenue losses and expenditures that you didn't anticipate making. I think what's going to happen over the next couple weeks and month or so is that the legislature will try to reconcile those bills out and come up with a single version that meets the policy needs, provides appropriate oversight and flexibility to local governments to meet a wide variety of different needs. I think that kind of deals with that. It's real technical accounting type of stuff, but it is important because we don't want to put municipalities in a position where you wind up with these long-term obligations for what should have been handled on a short-term basis.
Thanks, Mark, for breaking all that down. To everyone watching, I promise we're trying to troubleshoot the tech issues. Some folks in the comments have said that if you rewind the video a little bit and don't necessarily watch it live, so maybe on a 5-10 second delay, it may work better. If we can't get this figured out, and trust me, we're all trying very hard here on the back end. If we can't, we're also recording the conversation here on Zoom, so we will be able to share that uninterrupted video feed later on. So please bear with us, and thank you so much for sticking with us. Mark, just a quick follow-up question before I toss it to Sheila. What's the timeline on these bills? When do we expect something to pass, and is there any sort of deadline that they need to get passed by?
I think the logical approach is going to be that they kind of go along with the state budget and how state fiscal issues are going to be handled. I think logically for the legislature to approach them that way, that makes a lot of sense. There's not a hard deadline, it needs to be done by the end of the calendar year. However, getting rid of uncertainty for municipal officials where they can start to do some planning would warrant it get done before, ideally the end of July or would be great. If not, then for sure the end of September. So we're going into the last quarter of the year with a little more certainty and knowing what we need to do. One of the challenges, as I mentioned before, is the uncertainty. And in a sense, the longer you wait to act on some of these things, the more certainty you have because the more information you have. The challenge is hitting that balance of how long it takes to get things done versus the information you have and the requirements that you need to fix some of these problems.
Great, thank you. And then to pivot now to the state budget and state finances, I have a question for Sheila. Like local governments that are experiencing all of these budget holes, as Mark has described, so is the state. So what kind of financial damage has New Jersey sustained due to the pandemic so far? And what options does the state have, given that they're constitutionally required to pass a balanced budget without any sort of debt?
Thanks, Lily. Yeah, so the coronavirus outbreak has been the perfect storm from a fiscal standpoint, right? Demand for government services that are essential during a public health crisis increased sharply. That includes public health workers and police and first responders, Medicaid, financial assistance to small businesses. And at the same time, the economy grinded to a halt, which has left the state without the amount of tax revenue that the state was expecting when it crafted the budget last spring. Tax collections have taken a major hit among all the major sources: income tax, sales tax, corporate business tax, motor fuels, casinos, lottery sales. And in response, the state has proposed over $5 billion in cuts or delays, delayed spending through September 30th to slow down the damage, but it's clearly not enough. Both OLS, the Office of Legislative Services, and the Treasury have mostly agreed that New Jersey is facing an estimated $2.7 billion shortfall for this year, fiscal year, which ends on June 30th, and another $7 billion shortfall projected for 21, which, compared to the governor's budget proposal that was released in February. So those estimates might be a little bit smaller if they were calculated a little differently. So yes, the future is uncertain. New Jersey is required to balance their budget, even in recessions. There are options available to the state to close the gap, and it is likely that they will all be involved and be included in some degree to get New Jersey through this financial crisis. They include additional federal aid to shore up the shortfalls, service cuts and layoffs to achieve some savings, new taxes to raise revenue quickly, and or the authorization to borrow to best meet the needs of New Jersey residents at this time, at this critical time.
Thank you, Sheila. And then when you talk about borrowing, do you have a dollar figure that you can put to that? How much is the state looking to borrow, or how big is the hole?
So together, the Murphy administration is estimating between this fiscal year and the next year a $10 billion hole.
And then some context for folks watching: New Jersey's budget is about $40 billion. So a $10 billion budget hole, that's serious business. Okay.
Yes,
so,
and you can make the when you look at it in a slightly different way, just percentage of our loss. I believe this year is a loss of 7%, and then the next fiscal year is looking a little bit larger. Let me see if I can just pull that up real quickly. Here it is. So fiscal year, yes, this year is 7%, and next year's budget is looking at an 18% shortfall.
So those are huge gaps. And as we said before, when you have a big budget shortfall, especially 7 to 18%, there aren't many options to deal with it. One of them is making cuts to public services and laying off public employees. So my question to Marc is, it's clear that local governments, municipalities, counties, they're dealing with these shortfalls, and they clearly want to avoid these service cuts and layoffs, and they want to buy some time to allow the economy to recover. What options do municipalities have to borrow if they need or see the need to borrow to avoid these cuts?
So I'd like to frame that in how you finance these revenue shortfalls and pay for these one-time expenses that you may have. And here I think one-time expenses are going to be two times. It'll be this year and next year. And the challenge is the thing that creates most of that are going to be these revenue shortfalls, and particularly on the state side. That's the real cause of the state's problems, is that the economy isn't producing the revenue we need. When we get to municipalities and counties, there's a couple ways to look at it. From a short-term standpoint, most of our organizations are in reasonably good financial condition that they can finance these short-term obligations during the budget year with their existing fund balances. They don't need to borrow to have enough cash to pay their bills. The catch will be when they have to pay that back, when they've got to restore their balances and get back on a good fiscal footing. That's where we talk about issuing notes, which are short-term things. You can borrow from a local bank or go to the bond markets. Those interest rates are short-term. They're usually very competitive. And we normally, as we said, we normally run these from 3 to 5 years, and the municipality or county has a choice in how long they're going to do that note payment for. And those traditionally work very well. And here's where the uncertainty comes in. If these revenue shortfalls for this year and potentially for next year are very large, maybe the burden on taxpayers of paying it back over 3 to 5 years may be too significant. So maybe we want to go to 10 years, or we start looking at a long-term problem where we go going out longer than 7 years, where now you want to bring in, because of that extraordinary nature of it, you want to bring in the state oversight agencies, I mentioned the local finance board, to take a second look and put another set of eyes on the calculations the municipality is looking at doing, to make sure what's being talked about is prudent and not just taking advantage of the situation to burden future taxpayers 10, 15, 20 years down the road with these burdens that are taking place in 2020 and 2021. So there's a balance that we need to strike in order to ensure that the borrowing is prudent, that the impact on taxpayers is not excessive, right? And kind of find a balancing where all of those things can come together and work in a good solution for everybody.
Great, thank you, Marc. My next question is now for Sheila, and it's about a specific proposal that's moving through the legislature as it relates to state borrowing. So at the beginning of June, the Assembly passed what's called the COVID-19 Emergency Bond Act. The first question here is, why does New Jersey need state legislation to borrow from the federal government? And then if you could also get into, what does this bill do exactly? How does it work? What are the mechanics? What are the maturity schedules of the bonds?
Thanks, Louis. So New Jersey's constitution states that borrowing money to cover operating costs is only permitted with the approval of the voters. So it has to go before the voters to vote, yes or no, whether we're going to borrow to pass a balanced budget. However, there is an exception mentioned that in an emergency such as times of war or a natural disaster, borrowing may be allowed without having to go through that voter approval process. But for the governor to be given that authority and access cash assistance from the federal government, legislation must first be passed that would trigger these emergency borrowing powers. The strategy was sparked actually by the Federal Reserve, which for the first time ever is willing to directly buy up to $500 billion in short-term municipal debt with the creation of the Municipal Liquidity Facility, or MLF, which I'll speak to a little bit later. So the proposed Emergency Bond Act, which passed the State Assembly 3 weeks ago, would allow for up to $5 billion in state general obligation bonds to be issued in response to the pandemic. And the bill would also allow the Murphy administration to borrow up to $9 billion to help smaller counties and cities get access to emergency lending that would normally not happen. They normally don't have access. And supposedly these are going to be offered with favorable rates. These loans would technically have to be paid back in 3 years, but the legislation also would allow the state to refinance, giving those bonds potential maturities lasting up to 35 years. So yes, putting off payments to future taxpayers, something that New Jersey has chronically done in the past. We are future taxpayers paying for New Jersey's past sins, but yes, it's an uncomfortable situation to consider that we are in this position of having to make payments over a long term. Treasury officials have said that the debt service, the cost of borrowing for these could run up to $50 million annually for every $1 billion borrowed. And the OLS fiscal note pretty much agrees with that. It's not without controversy though, this legislation, Republican legislators have threatened to bring a lawsuit against the issuance of the $5 billion general obligation bonds because of this this exception. Could be, they believe the interpretation is not correct, that this kind of borrowing would need voter approval. And it appears that the Senate is taking a wait and see approach to state finances, probably once the summer is over, to see really where we are. Again, so much uncertainty in this scenario. So it seems to be that the Senate is not moving the bill right now, perhaps to sort of see where we're at July and August and going into September. Do you agree with that, Marc?
Yeah, I think just to amplify a couple points, that $9 billion that you referred to is not, the purpose of that is not primarily to support local government borrowing. That primarily can be used for cash flow. The intent of the liquidity facility is to deal with short-term revenue losses that states and locals can incur. So if a state needs cash flow assistance, they can tap that as a short-term cash flow loan. Most municipalities and counties should not have to tap into that because those rates are, in a sense, competitive with the market, and they're just a little ahead of the market. And given New Jersey's bond rating, which is not the best in the world, we will be paying more than we would in the market, but it supports the fact that it tells the market that somebody's going to buy that paper at the end of the day, and that's important. But municipalities and counties probably won't have to use it. We can come back to that if you want, but the notion of that having that available for state cash flow purposes, one of the challenges will become is that it's required to be paid back at the end of 3 years. And if we can't pay it back, if we haven't generated the revenue to pay that back, the option becomes issuing what's called and allowed under the bill, refunding bonds. And those that can add on top of the $5 billion. And if you're doing $5 billion at that 50 million per year rate, well, that's $250 million in added debt service that the state would be incurring just for the $5 billion. If you go more on that, you now have to ask the question, and I think this is the hard question for the governor and the legislature. If we're adding $250 million of debt service to the budget every year, what revenue is going to pay for that? Are we going to look at tax increases to pay for that? Are we going to count on economic growth, which has always been a really challenging issue for us to count on it? Or do you try to offset that borrowing with additional changes in the state budget? That could be service reductions, that could be changes in public policy. And in a sense, we have a crisis that, maybe this is an opportunity to make some changes that we haven't otherwise had the opportunity or political will to make.
I totally agree. Yes, so we've always talked about tax reform generally, and we don't have a lot of political will to make those big changes. And this goes back to the idea that we have a limited number of options, and it's going to be like, what's the best recipe to make this all work, right? How much should we borrow? How much should we cut? How much revenue can we raise quickly? And that's the big challenge before us.
Yeah, I think at the end of that is also, how are we making those decisions? For example, if we're going to issue the debt, one of the questions is, well, what's the maturity of the debt? How long are we going to take to pay it off? There's a lot of real significant public policy and fiscal issues that need to be part of that discussion. And I think we need to ensure that the legislature and the governor have a way of reconciling their various interests to make sure that we're getting a good balanced approach on this.
Great.
Back to you, Lou.
Yeah, thank both of you for that incredibly thorough answer. So much of that resonated with me. Marc, what you just said about the balanced approach, that's something we've been calling for at NJPP since this pandemic hit. Especially since historically in recessions, we've done the opposite of a balanced approach where we've just, cut and kept cutting. And it's gotten to the point where during the last recession, especially, we really cut to the bone. And I'm personally not sure what's left to cut. We're looking at services and staff that were once thought uncuttable, from teachers and schools possibly closing, to other essential services that our communities really rely on. And then Sheila, your point on passing off the buck to future taxpayers. I can't say this with certainty, but I think I'm the youngest person on this call. So that line especially
Definitely not
me. Talking about future taxpayers, but I'd just like to take one step back and ask Sheila a clarifying question. You had mentioned the Municipal Liquidity Facility, the MLF, in your previous answer. Can you just give us some background and describe what that program is and what the pros and cons of this loan program are?
Sure, and please, Marc, jump in. He clarified a little bit for me. So the establishment of the MLF means that the state and local governments have access to immediate sources of cash that they can use to navigate the economic downturn and avoid devastating cuts to healthcare or mass layoffs of state employees. And very large sums are available. It seems clear that the Federal Reserve will make loans for a very broad range of purposes, including addressing current deficits. That alone presents a real alternative to dangerous cuts and layoffs. I can't say it enough. What else can I say about it? Again, they offer a 3-year credit, which is available to cover any revenue shortfalls associated with the pandemic, as well as any additional expenses associated with the crisis. Any eligible state or locality can borrow up to 1/5 of its own revenues based on 2017 numbers. So that's tens of billions of dollars for some of the larger states and cities. They can be taken out by the end of 2020, so they need to decide whether it's happening or not. And the interest rates range between 1.5 to 5.9, depending on the issuer credit rating. And for most issuers, these rates will be somewhat higher than maybe available in the private markets. And for some issuers and levels of borrowing, they will be lower. Marc, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think while municipalities can effectively borrow from it, they are only the largest places, and we're talking government agencies of more than 500,000 in population, which leaves us to just nine counties essentially. But any of our cities or municipalities that needed to borrow it, if they needed to go there, would have to basically go through state government to borrow on their behalf, and that agency would then be responsible for paying back state government. If we have counties or municipalities that need to issue debt, there's a couple of other tools that they have to use. For example, most county, or not most, but many county governments have what we call county improvement authorities, and most of those authorities run loan programs where the municipality can effectively borrow from the county improvement authority, who will issue the bonds, but they'll have the backing of the county. And when we have counties with AA and AAA bond ratings, those rates, even with the cost of going through the county improvement authority, those rates may be cheaper than what the municipality be able to get on its own. So, municipalities and counties can go to the market on their own, and with state oversight, you give the market additional insurances to the quality of the bonds that are being issued. They could do it through a county improvement authority. We have, for a number of local government units, we have a new capacity that came up in a law that was passed a couple of years ago through our joint insurance funds, where a joint insurance fund, which would have a lot of balances, can now buy the debt of its members. So that will be an opportunity for municipalities and counties that are part of these joint insurance pools. So that's another option. And another one that's little known is that as to make investments, municipalities that have cash to make investments, some of them actually go out and buy the debt of other municipalities, counties, or local authorities, because the interest rate they get on those is going to be better than what they may be doing on their own investments in the market. So counties and municipalities all together, they have a number of options on how they can borrow money. State, much more limited.
Right, and just quickly to go back to what the MLF, it's not all set in stone. There is an opportunity at the federal level to improve it. And in fact, the HEROES Act does have some improvements that passed in the House, but don't know what the chances are in the Senate. For
Yeah.
instance, like the loan term is 3 years. It's pretty short. There potentially could be the opportunity to extend the deadline to borrow beyond 2020, since so much uncertainty is, before us. There should be the option, the Federal Reserve, to have the freedom to forgive the loan if necessary, and the interest rates, which currently I think exceed the private market, could be much lower. And then there should be an opportunity for more entities to borrow directly from the MLF. I mean, that is all to say, like, this is the first time they've ever done this. They recognize the crisis, but I think that just a good to mention that there is a little bit of room of improvement, and it has been addressed so far in the Heroes Act.
Yeah, I think those are really good points, and I think if the federal legislation addresses that is really useful. I think one of the things the theme through all this is uncertainty. Right now, you have to borrow the money by the end of this calendar year. If that were to be extended, even by 6 months, that would be a great boon for government agencies, because now they're knowing how the economy is coming back. They know what their weaknesses are. They can do better fiscal estimating at that point. Having that additional time to close those loans would probably be the single best thing that can happen. Next best thing is extending the term.
Great. Thank you both so much for really getting in the weeds there. I know I appreciated that, and I'm sure our viewers did too. I'm seeing the comments now, and I think this is the perfect time to transition to the audience Q&A portion of the program. So for folks who are watching, if you haven't already, please drop your questions into the comments. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. I know that we have at least 2 or 3 good ones right off the bat. So looking at the clock, if we could just be a little tight with these answers. Perfect. And
Okay.
I'm gonna let everyone, I'm gonna say who asked each question. And I'm saying this to also apologize in advance if I do not pronounce your name correctly. I truly am sorry. So the first question is from Hiba Abu Sliman. And this is a great question. Sheila, I'll kick this one to you first. How is New Jersey ensuring that the financial burdens of this crisis won't fall on lower income and middle class residents, i.e. higher taxes on wealthier residents, grants from the federal government, rent assistance for lower income residents? There will not only be serious economic implications for lower income residents, not only in terms of job loss, but also in the defunding of public services and schools in lower income communities. So that's it. The question there is, what is New Jersey doing to ensure that the recovery doesn't leave behind lower income and middle class residents?
That's a great question.
Answer.
The short answer, the elevator pitch right here is that yes, the communities that he is referring to are often the first to feel the effects of a recession in a crisis like this, and are often the last to recover from it. New Jersey has learned the hard way that when you leave these communities behind during tough times, the recession goes on longer, the recovery is slower, and we can't repeat the same mistakes again. So that is why this menu of, the menu of options that we're talking about need to be all looked at, because we can't take a cuts only approach. You ask what New Jersey is doing right now. It's up to us, quite frankly, to tell our legislators that we don't want a cuts only approach, because it's harmful. It's dangerous to cut services at a time when they're critically needed. So to push the legislators to keep all the options on the table is probably the most important thing we could be telling our legislators right now, to avoid, again, what we've done in the past and has proven to be extremely harmful. Do you have something to add to that, Marc?
No, I don't think so, Sheila. You cover the points, and I think that the issues raised are absolutely real. They are the essential challenges that state government has always faced. We've faced them in different ways, given different administrations over time. And this may be it's becoming sort of a trite phrase, but a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And this may be that opportunity where we can say, okay, what is our reset here? How do we look at the state's economy going forward? How do we handle with the way the different revenue sources that we have in the state budget, and start and not necessarily look at the margin the way we've traditionally done it, but say, okay, what is the policy that we really need to have to make this recovery a sustainable one? And sustainable here at all levels, that one helps low and moderate income householders and workers, but at the same time ensures that we set the stage for economic growth, which requires investment of the private sector. We need to find that magic spot where those Venn diagrams come together nicely. And that's the hard part.
Yes, no, it's definitely not easy, which is why the work that you both are doing is so important. Something we like to say at NJPP is that budgets are more than line items and numbers and fiscal documents, but there are priorities as a state. So like Marc and Sheila both said, this is a great opportunity to hit the reset button a little bit and say, okay, let's take a step back and look at what are we prioritizing, what are we not prioritizing, and what can we do differently? So here's hoping that state lawmakers take this opportunity to do that, because we could be doing so much more for our communities, low-income communities, working class communities, and middle-class residents. Things have been skewed for far too long in favor of the wealthy and well-connected and special interests, and hopefully we can put a stop to that. Another question we have in the comments, this one is from Karen Haskin. So thank you, Karen, for tuning in. And this is a great question. Is New Jersey in more fiscal trouble than other states?
Easy answer, yes.
It depends it depends on how you look at it. Yeah, I mean, yes, we've already been in deep trouble here in New Jersey because of our outsized obligations. We've kicked the can down the road for 3 decades, and we were just starting to make some progress in addressing those. And then this happened.
Yeah, this is the worst time for us. We were starting to get our pension systems funded. We were boosting up our Medicare payments. We were trying to absorb all of these things. And New Jersey has always, our government, in a sense, our desires for government at the local level, at the school level, at the state level, our desires of what we want are more than we generally agree that we want to pay for. All right, where people say we want local schools. All right, now there's a lot of evidence that says regional schools are a lot more cost efficient, but we want local schools. We want local control. We want, I'm not going to get into the debate about municipal government costs, because I could do that for an hour. But we have a lot of issues, and we've always wanted to do more than what we wanted to pay, what we want to pay. And we have not been able to figure out how we work those things out. I suppose I should give a shout out to the Path to Progress project that I was part of a couple years ago in the legislature, and what Senator Sweeney helped pull together, along with the speaker and the folks on the minority side. A number of recommendations from that were useful, but that was a start to get discussion going, and we had discussion going, and then the coronavirus shows up. So we need to figure out how to leverage this opportunity to see what changes we can make to get ourselves on a better road going forward.
And just when we look at just the coronavirus and what it's done to our budget, the estimates of how much decline in our general fund in terms of tax revenue, we're not the worst state. I mean, it's like, if you look at it that way, Colorado is in a much deeper hole. Hawaii is in big trouble. Illinois, of course, is our evil twin in terms of fiscal problems. They don't look good either. And New Mexico is in deep trouble as well as Wyoming. These are states that have a much bigger hole to deal with in response to the coronavirus itself. So I hope that gives you a little sense of where New Jersey's at.
Yeah, thank you for contextualizing that, Sheila, and Marc, for your thoughtful answer. Regarding the path to progress and those recommendations, I just want to add some background info that the prompt that was given to that working group was how can you fix the state's finances without raising new revenue? So I just want to say that out loud since it came up. And Sheila, I was going through, today is Throwback Thursday, so I was looking through old reports, and there are so many reports that NJPP has been putting out for the past years and years that have just rang the alarm that New Jersey is not prepared for the next economic downturn. We were saying it last year, we were saying it the year before that, we were saying it the year before that. And a big part of that is we just never built up healthy reserves or a rainy day fund to cushion any sort of economic fall, which has left us, kind of caught with our pants down here, where we were not prepared at all for the COVID crisis. We have one question for Marc. This is from Joseph Zalasik. He says, Marc, will fire districts get any state relief outside of FEMA reimbursements? FYI, you did a great job at DCA. I remember you working with the fire districts.
Fire districts are one of the unique aspects of New Jersey government in about 100 municipalities. I don't know an answer to that question, Joe. I think any money that's going to come down for fire districts is going to have to come out of the primarily the state share of CARES money. There is some money that is coming to local governments through the federal government Department of Justice grants. There's a series of fire and police grants that come down for paid employees. There may be some relief for districts that are eligible for those programs, and you'll wind up being notified, I'm sure, when that money becomes available. I know Congressman Pasquale is very aggressive in those programs as a leader in Congress in advocating for those. Let's talk to him.
Great, thank you, Marc. So we're about at time. It's 12:55 right now. So we have two questions that if we could just rapid answer them, because I want to get these in. The first one is from Ralph Humphrey. What are the current interest rates under the MLF?
Right.
So there's not a really hard number. The way that works, they're basically setting a bottom number that is an index rate that is based on current investment values, which is a relatively low number. It's around 1.5%, I think, right now.
Yes.
But what they're doing is they're adding what we call basis points, which is incremental increases in interest rates based on the state's general bond rating. So, for example, a county or a municipality that's a AAA rated can borrow from the MLF. I think it's 115 basis points based on that AAA rating. New Jersey, which with its current A- rating, that number goes to about 265 basis points. So that's an additional over 2.5% higher than what that base interest rate is going to be. And that's the way the numbers are working right now.
Right, that's correct. I think the range is 1.5 to 5.9 is what I picked up.
Okay, that's helpful. Marc, when you started that answer, there were no numbers in it, so I was a little concerned. So the last question, and maybe this, I know this probably needs a long answer, but if we can just keep it very brief. All of this talk about borrowing, what does it mean for the average property taxpayer? As folks are aware, New Jersey has a 2% cap on property taxes. Does this type of borrowing bump up against this mandate?
I'll go with that. From a property tax standpoint, the state dollars, the money the state may borrow, not going to be much of an impact potentially. Right? Property taxes for local governments, depending on how much money they need to spend, that's not reimbursed by the federal government. What they're hitting in revenue losses, potential loss in property tax rateables, which doesn't mean a revenue loss per se, but it means higher property tax rates for everybody else to maintain the current level of spending that they have. That could result in higher rates for folks. It's going to be very localized at the municipal by municipal level. The uncertainty is still a killer here. I'm not in a position, I don't think anybody is, to guess what the impact is going to be unless you look at a particular municipalities or counties numbers. And remember, we're still uncertain about how much federal aid is going to come back. And that federal aid will act as an offset to revenue losses, to emergency spending, and how we recover. So the uncertainty is the killer here, and that seems like a good way to probably close this, which is kind of how we started.
Perfect. So with that, do either of you have any very brief closing remarks?
I've sometimes said in presentations I've done, the coronavirus is what's in charge right now, and uncertainty is the real enemy, and we're not going to knock that down very fast. So we need to just be flexible, plan for things that are contingent in nature, and just be able to respond as quickly as we can.
In an equitable way. Going back to normal wasn't great for everybody in the state. And so I just want to reiterate the idea that as we reimagine our budgets going into the future, that we put a lens on it that questions whether these priorities are equitable, whether they enhance racial equity in our state. These are important questions going forward. And I think that it's the best way to take a crisis and come back as a state.
Perfect. Thank you both so much, Marc and Sheila. This was such an incredible conversation. If I'm being totally honest, I was a little worried at the beginning of this that we would go a little too far into the weeds, but I think we did a great job of taking these broad concepts and really pulling back the curtain and showing folks how these things work and how these systems operate. So thank you two so much for really connecting the dots for us. With that, thank you all for tuning in. We apologize if there were any technical difficulties. We're not totally sure what was behind them, but we think we were able to help a little bit. If it's helpful, we will post the Zoom recording on Facebook so folks can watch it there. And with that, I would just like to once again thank the sponsors of the Progress 2020 series, Horizon, the B. Gill Group, and RWJ Barnabas. Thank you so much for the support. And just to make one quick pitch, NJPP, for us to do the work that we do, we need some help funding the facts. So if you have the means, please consider sending us a donation at njpp.org/donate. We sincerely appreciate it. And if we have any NJPP swag laying around, we will send that to you as a thank you. But with that, thank you, everyone. Keep an eye out for the next event. We have a few more Progress 2020 events coming down the pike. So keep an eye out for your email. Keep an eye out on Facebook. Make sure you're following us and that you're subscribing to our email so you can get our Friday Facts and Figures every Friday with the biggest facts of the week. So with that, thank you, Marc. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, everyone. And
thank you. Our pleasure.